My friend Danny lived in a remote spot out in the woods. This was in high school, and I was still living with my parents, but we had a normal house out in the suburbs. Since Danny had such a cool place, my other friends and I would visit him very often, usually once every weekend. Since it was kind of far, I would always borrow my mom's car to drive out there, and usually pick up one or two of my other friends before going. On the way in, I was on a dirt road that led to his house and to a few of his neighbors' places as well. It was not a private road, but it was not used very much. That's why I was surprised to see a car stopped on the side of the road. The red taillights worked as reflectors, and I could see them pretty well, even though it was almost dark out. I was with my friend Vince at the time, and he suggested that we stop to check it out. I agreed, so we pulled up behind it. The both of us got out and took a closer look. It was a new-looking black Toyota, nothing strange about it, just a normal car like one you would see every day. The only strange thing about it was that the driver's side window was wide open, and there was nobody there. We thought it might have been somebody going to use the bathroom in the woods, so we let it go and went on our way. When we got to Danny's house, we had a fire in the backyard and then went inside to play some video games. By around midnight, Vince and I took off, and we were back on that same road. When we got to the spot where we saw the car, it was gone. However, when we turned a bend in the road, there it was. This time it was facing the opposite direction. I commented to Vince, and he was as shocked as I was. Neither of us could understand what was going on at that point. There was no house near enough that it would make sense to leave a car there, so there was no obvious reason for it. We just couldn't explain it. This time we didn't want to stop, because it was a little creepier later at night. When we made it back to the paved roads, Vince and I joked how it was probably a ghost car, then I dropped him off and headed home. I told Danny what I saw on the road, and he told me that he had been seeing a similar-looking car on those roads as well, but didn't know what they were doing. We talked about it for a bit, but then let it go, because it wasn't actually that concerning in hindsight. The next weekend I went out there again, and sure enough, that same car was on the road, close to where we had seen it before. I drove right past it this time, and when I got to my friend's house, I told him what I saw. Danny was curious about what was going on with that car, as was I. After we hung out for a while, we started talking about it, and we both wanted to go and find out what was going on. By the time night fell, we had decided to go out there and see if the car was still there. It was just Danny and me this time, so we got into my car and drove the 15 minutes to the spot where I had seen it earlier in the night. The car was still where I had seen it before, so I pulled my car off to the side on a small path that led off the road. It was effectively hidden from the strange car there, but we could still see the glowing reflectors of the dark Toyota. We sat and watched for about 20 minutes, and then we were starting to get bored, so Danny suggested that we go over and take a closer look. I agreed, so we got out and walked over to it. The moonlight that night was just bright enough that we could find our way around, and when we got to the car, there was nothing unusual about it. I think Danny was hoping to find something incriminating. He probably had some idea in his mind that there was something sinister going on. I'd be lying if I said I didn't have the same thought. We both had our phone lights out, and even when we looked in the windows, there was nothing notable. Then out of nowhere, we heard a man yell, "Get away! Get out of here," or something like that. It sounded like he was right behind us, and when I turned around, my light landed on a man. He was at least 40 years old with dark black hair and gray stubble on his face. The next thing I noticed about him was that he was pissed. Before I knew it, he had shoved me to the ground. My head almost hit the bumper of the car on my way down. I dropped my phone in the fall, but by then Danny had turned around to face the man, so I could see him as he stood over me. That was when the man pulled out a gun and pointed it at me. As Danny came over to try to help, the man pointed his piece at him instead. All the while, he was screaming at us to get out of there. I couldn't force a word out, but Danny said we would go, and he tried to explain that we were just checking on the car. I was hesitant, but eventually, I got up. The man tentatively lowered his gun while I was getting up. He didn't raise it again. Danny continued trying to explain the whole thing. He tried to say that we were checking if anybody needed help. That was technically a lie, because we were just snooping. Once I got to my feet, we both ran back to my car, and then went back to Danny's place. We told his parents right away, and they called the cops. By the time the police showed up, the car was gone. We never saw that car again afterward, so I guess he moved on. None of us know for sure what he was doing there. But we all had our theories. Vince thinks he was growing weed on some of the vacant land around there. I think that makes more sense than any other explanation, but I'm still not sure. Either way, he was a real psycho, and we were lucky to get away from him. About 15 years ago, when I was in my late 20s, I landed a new job on the other side of the country. Since I didn't have much stuff, I decided to save some money and take only what I could fit into my tiny car. I had to get rid of my bed and some other furniture, but nothing that I was really attached to. Once I was all loaded up, pretty much the whole car was packed. There was no room for another person, because even my passenger seat was filled. I was a little worried about getting pulled over, since I couldn't see out the back or side, but I decided to risk it anyway. It was a lonely drive at the start, and I was expecting to be on the road for 3 days. On the first day, nothing much happened, so we can skip ahead to the second night, when things got interesting. That night, I was planning to stop at a hotel, and I made a reservation. It did have late check-ins, so I didn't have to worry about making good time. However, before I made it there, I was running low on gas. There was a sign for a station that I saw on the highway, so I figured it was as good a place as any. It was 11 p.m. The darkness covered everything as soon as I took the exit off the highway. When the gas station came into sight, I almost thought it was closed, but I pulled in anyway. The station was nearly deserted, with only a few cars parked in random spots. When I pulled up to one of the pumps, I could see that it was lit up and definitely open. I got out of my car and started filling up the tank. The convenience store that was attached to the station was dark, and its lights were turned off, making me think that it was closed. That didn't bother me much, because I just wanted to get on the road as soon as possible. As I stood there watching the numbers on the pump climb, a man approached me out of nowhere. I was looking down when he came up to me, so I didn't see where he came from. He was young, probably around 18 years old, and he looked nervous. He definitely startled me, but I wasn't scared. I hadn't heard him approach over the hum of the gas pump. He stood there, his expression serious. His eyes were scanning the area, as if looking for something or someone. The first thing he said to me was that the gas station was closed and that I needed to leave right away. I still need to pay, I told him. But he shook his head, his voice was low. Just leave now, he insisted, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I was confused. The pump was still running, and I didn't like the idea of driving off without paying. Moreover, he made me anxious, and when I looked over at him again, he was wearing normal clothes. No name tag or anything, so it didn't look like he worked there. Who was this kid anyway, telling me to leave a public gas station? Look, I don't know what's going on, but I can't just drive away without paying, I argued, hoping to get some sense out of him. He didn't respond to my point. Instead, he repeated his warning. You need to go now. With that, he walked away briskly, disappearing as suddenly as he arrived. Feeling confused and uneasy, I quickly finished pumping and then paid with my credit card at the pump. Then I got back into my car and loaded up the directions on my phone. I was ready to get out of there. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a slow drive around the parking lot to see if anything weird was going on. I shifted my car into drive and pulled out of the pump area. I could only see where my headlights landed, but there was nothing at first. Eventually, I made it around to the store. Like I thought, it seemed to be closed. The light from my car flooded in through the window, and it looked empty. One thing seemed strange at the time, though. Like I said earlier, there were a few cars there. I wondered who they belonged to if the store was closed. I guessed the young man that came up to me must have had one, but there were at least two other cars. As I rounded the corner behind the convenience store, my headlights swept across the back wall of the building. I was about to turn around and go back when one of the doors on the building swung open, suddenly. Two men jumped out, and they were both holding guns. They pointed their weapons directly at my car. I knew right away that there was a robbery, and I was in real danger. I hit the gas, and my tires screeched. I took a sharp turn away from them. I didn't look back, just focused on getting back onto the highway, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that gas station. As I went, I was worried that they would shoot, but I took some comfort in the fact that my car was so full. I knew it was probably enough to stop a bullet, crazy as that sounds. I never heard a shot, though. Once I was safely merging onto the highway, my hands were still trembling on the wheel, and I pulled my phone out to dial 911. I reported the robbery, describing the location and the little I had seen of the assailants. The operator assured me that officers were on their way to the scene. I hung up, trying to steady my breathing and make some sense of what had just happened. As I continued down the highway, the adrenaline gradually subsided. I wondered why that first man had warned me. I figure he was involved, yet he pushed me to leave. I don't think he was one of the men with guns, but I'm not completely sure. I got to my hotel that night and checked in just after midnight. The cops told me to expect a call the next day, in case they needed me to help identify anybody. The next morning, I received the call. They caught the robbers when they were still in the gas station, so they didn't need anything else from me. I was relieved and spent the rest of the day driving. What happened to them after the arrest, I'm not sure. I think they were young, though. The one guy that I saw up close was definitely young, and I think the other two were as well. I guess it was just some kids being stupid, but I almost got shot that night, and age is no excuse for that. This story dates back to when I was a student at university. It was the summer between my third and fourth year, so I would have been 21. I had an apartment with my two best friends, James and Harry. Harry always spent the entire summer back home with his family, but James and I stayed at our place for the summer. We both got some crappy jobs and made just enough money to keep the bills paid. Later on in the summer, we decided to take some time off and do a road trip to see some of the spots that we had never had time for. James had a beat-up old station wagon that he hardly used, but our building came with a parking spot, so we kept it. That was good, because renting a car would have been way too expensive. We fitted the vehicle with a makeshift bed in the back so we could sleep in it if we needed to. There was a small town on the water that we had been wanting to see, so that was our first destination. We left late in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and it was 5 by the time we were out on the open highway. It was supposed to be a 9-hour drive, so we knew that we were probably going to have to pull over for the night, especially since we hadn't booked anywhere to stay. We didn't worry about that, though, and we just kept driving. By 10 in the evening, it was pitch dark, and we were keeping an eye out for somewhere to stop. We were quite a ways out of the city, and it was kind of remote. We would pass a gas station or a small town every so often, and in between, it was just trees on both sides of the road. That's when a bright set of headlights almost blinded us from behind. I squinted as I looked in the rearview mirror. There was somebody behind us. They were tailgating close. I tapped the brakes, hoping that they would see my taillights and take the hint. When that didn't work, I pressed the brakes harder, hoping they would go around. This time it seemed to work. The car sped past us, but as they did, I saw a person yell and flip us off from the passenger seat. I got a pretty good look at the car, and I could tell that there were 3 people. 2 in the front seat and 1 in the back. The 2 in the front both flipped us off, but the one in the back was quiet and still. I only saw them for a second, but it still seemed creepy. The 2 in the front were middle-aged men. The driver was overweight and bald, while the one in the passenger seat was smaller and wore a hat. The person in the back seat looked younger, and it was a guy as well. Once they were gone, James and I were relieved, because it was scary. Not long after that, we found a place to stop for the night. It was just a simple rest stop with nothing but an outhouse and a few parking spots surrounded by trees. We had accepted the fact that we would be sleeping in the car, and didn't mind since it would save us money. On the way in, we saw a sign saying that you're not supposed to stay the night. We went in anyway. The space was empty, and when we drove in, James parked in the farthest corner because it was far away from the light. The outhouse was on the other side, and there was just a single light on it, that being the only light there. We got out our sleeping bags and then sat up talking for a while. Just as we were about to go to sleep, light flooded into the car. Somebody else had entered, that was clear. For no reason in particular, I looked up and out the back window to see who it was, and I was pretty sure it was that car from before. It had still been less than an hour since we saw that car, but I thought they would have been farther ahead. The other car stopped on the other end of the parking area, right next to the outhouse. As soon as it stopped, two people got out of the car, and I could hear them talking, but it wasn't clear what they were saying. Then I saw one of them open the back door, and the other guy got out. By then, I was certain it was the other car, because I recognized the larger guy. When the younger guy in the back got out, I saw the larger man shove him up against the car. His back was facing me, so I couldn't see much, but I could tell that it was hostile. Then I heard a pounding sound, and I was pretty sure they were slamming him against the car. I looked at James, and he was watching too. "What should we do?" he whispered to me. "I don't know," I said. Then I pulled out my phone, but there was spotty service at best. I later found out that emergency calls often go through with bad service, but I didn't know that at the time. When I took another look out there, I was pretty sure they were beating the crap out of him. James and I both knew that we had to do something. We couldn't just let this happen, but we didn't know if they were armed, so neither of us wanted to go out there. Remember that we were on the dark side of the parking area, so I wasn't even sure if they knew we were there. Then James had the idea to fire up the engine and see if we could scare them off. We both crept into the front of the car, and then James turned the engine over. It coughed a few times, and then roared to life. I looked over to the others, and they had stopped what they were doing and looked over to us. We made eye contact for a brief second, and then James must have gotten scared. He shifted the car into gear and drove out onto the highway. In hindsight, that was definitely a good move, because after a few minutes on the road, I was able to get service on my phone. I called the police and told them what we saw. I was told that somebody would be sent over to check it out. James pulled the car over to the side of the road, and we waited for the cops. We returned to the scene with the police, but the other car was gone by then. We walked around with the officer for a few minutes, and when we looked at the spot where we had seen the beating, there was a small pool of blood on the ground. The light from the outhouse was right above, so the red puddle of fresh blood glimmered slightly. What was really disturbing, though, was that we knew the victim was still with the guys who beat him. I don't know what was going on between those guys. We don't know if the victim was kidnapped or if they were friends and then got into a fight. By the way things were going, I wouldn't be surprised if they killed him if we hadn't intervened. This incident hung over our heads for the rest of the trip, and it was pretty much all I could think about the whole time. We ended up having an alright trip anyway, and we never ran into those guys again.